Hi, it's been a while to be here. I've been a bit lazy about reading a new paper because I was writing my own paper. But today I wanted to resume my memory about how freedom of thought or freedom of conscience has been constructed in the US jurisprudence, because I've been recently very interested in cognitive liberty. It's an emerging concept that the corporations have been seeking for users' attention, my attention, your attention. And everybody knows that attention becomes a most valuable asset. They really require our time and our energy, and they really want us to spend more time on their applications, and they are doing their best to get increased engagement of users by targeted advertising, targeted recommendations. And it's almost impossible to get out of those interventions like every day, because they are beneficial, but at the same time they are manipulative, and sometimes they are against our own free will. And many people are concerned about the juveniles' negative development of their own autonomy, and making decisions because they have been raised with those technology. And there are some scholars who have advocated for human beings need to reclaim their cognitive liberty, because it has been overlooked in the traditional jurisprudence, because cognitive has been in your brain, and even if somebody influences you, like try to manipulate your ideas, but still you are considered to have a choice by saying no, and I just don't want your influence, I want to walk away. So that's the idea, that ideas levels are not really legally protected, because your brain is yours and nobody can really do something on your brain. And if there is a physical intervention of your brain, it's of course it's an infringement of some rights. But if it is just about talking, if someone talks to you and try to make some influence on you, and if there is no compulsion or coercion, then your liberty in your brain is considered as protected instead of infringed. Yeah, that's the whole idea of only materialized expression, materialized behavior and activities and physical real things that are protected, but not your ideas or something happening in your brain. But because these days technologies are so techy, and they just really know how to make a very effective influence on your actually decisions, not only attention. And yeah, so there is an emerging like scholarship of cognitive liberty discussion, but I don't think it's a very big movement. But I wanted to argue for that movement in my upcoming publication. And so I wanted to look at freedom of thought scholarship. And this is Professor Marc Jonathan Blitz's Blitz 2010 article. So it's been a while there. I don't think like computer scientists ever really want to like cite these types of old article, but in law 2010 is not that old. And so we are okay with citing like 1980s or even 1930s. It might just showcase your like diligence of going through all the old materials. So 2010, I would say it's relatively new. So I will do what I've done before. I'm just gonna highlight and read many sentences as possible, and go through the whole article, and hopefully get some basic ideas and make some critiques if I can find anything. Is it freedom of thought is often described as a central liberty in our constitutional system? Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said that there is no principle that more imperatively calls for attachment than the principle of free thought. The Supreme Court has likewise often placed it at the center of our First Amendment jurisprudence, saying that our whole constitutional heritage rebels at giving government the power to control men's mind, and suggesting that the more well-known right to freedom of speech is importantly large because of the support it provides for our freedom of thought. Yeah, it's like freedom of speech is backed because of the central idea of freedom of thought. It has even said that freedom of mind is the broader concept of freedom of speech is but one component. So it means that freedom of mind encapsulates freedom of speech, but while the court has often celebrated freedom of thought, it has never clearly defined it or delineated its contours. Is freedom of mind a liberty that operates and protects only when we express our thoughts in speech or religious actions, or does it have independent force? This article suggests an answer by looking at a form of government regulation that arguably limits our right to think or enhance our powers of thought without limiting our freedom of speech or worship. More specifically, it asks whether the Constitution's freedom of thought places limits on the extent to which officials may restrict our use of cognitive enhancement technology. Such as the use of neurofeedback devices or psychiatric medications to overcome shyness or improve concentration and alertness. Ultimately, I argue the power to reshape our thinking processes biologically should be recognized as merely one form of a more general power that our freedom of mind is intended to place firmly in our own hands, not in the hands of the government officials. Is there anything regarding privacy? Okay, this article is not too long. Very minimal focus on privacy. I feel that cognitive liberty is somewhere between free speech and privacy, and this article mainly focuses on freedom of speech, which is First Amendment. Let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna, because it's my head is, I'm gonna move me. Okay. For decades, judges and scholars alike have celebrated our freedom of thought and described it as having a central place among our constitutional liberties. In 1937, Justice Cardozo said that freedom of thought, together with freedom of expression, constituted the matrix, the indispensable condition of nearly every other form of freedom. 40 years later, the Supreme Court suggested that freedom of thought not only stood alongside freedom of speech as the foundation of First Amendment jurisprudence, but was perhaps more basic, freedom of mind. The court said is the broader concept of which freedom of speech is but one component. In fact, the Supreme Court said on another occasion the Constitution protects speech largely because of its close connection to thought. Academic writers have agreed, noting that freedom of thought and belief is as close to an absolute right as any that exists in the Constitution. Is it? I wondered what this case is about. Need to look at this case. Need to look at this article too. The mind is safe harbor for which all outsiders can and should be excluded should we so desire. Yeah, intellectual privacy. If there is any constitutional right that is absolute, it's freedom of thought and belief, which is the precondition for all other political and religious rights guaranteed by the Western traditions. Like that. I'm gonna write out these references. But as central as freedom of thought is to our constitutional system, it is also something of a mystery. The Supreme Court has never said exactly what this freedom is. Never? Does it protect thought from government restriction only when we put that thought into words or some other form of First Amendment speech? Does it, in other words, recognize freedom of thought only where it is exercised or invoked together with freedom of expression when we create or serve as audience for a book, painting, or film, or where it is manifested in our exercise of freedom of association of our religious liberty? Or might the freedom of thought also stand on its own and protect our thinking even when the thinking is unaccompanied by any First Amendment expression, association, or religious practice? In the past, perhaps such a question may have seemed an entirely academic one. There was no reason for the law to protect our private, unexpressed thoughts because such internal thoughts were in any case beyond the reach of the state. Thus, John Locke said in 1689 that such is the nature of the understanding that it cannot be compelled to the belief of anything by outward force. Modern jurists and scholars have likewise noticed the mind's natural invulnerability to governmental control. Freedom of think, said Justice Frank Murphy, is absolute of its own nature. The most tyrannical government is powerless to control the inward workings of the mind. Is that really true? Because there was 1984 by George Orwell. The protagonist eventually testified that I love Big Brother when he died. So it means that his mentality was entirely manipulated by Big Brothers, and so I don't think the most tyrannical government doesn't have power to control the inward workings of the mind. Frederick Schauer likewise notes that thought is intrinsically free. The internal nature of the thought process erects a barrier between thought and the power of the government sanction. There was not much the government could do to restrict our freedom of thought except attack the expression of that thought in speech or worship. The government could not manipulate our minds from the inside. Its only way of restricting mental activity was to target the communication or other expression that embodies such activity. Those who wish to recruit resources from the outside world to reshape their framework of internal beliefs would do so by seeking religious or other cultural resources in the world around them. The development of neuroscience, psychiatry, and cognitive enhancement, however, has changed this state of affairs. Studies of the brain have in recent years generated a flood of discoveries about the biology that underlies our thinking. Francis Fukuyama aptly describes this neuroscientific revolution. Psychologists and philosophers trying to explain and repair malfunctions in our thoughts and feelings were long akin to a group of primitive tribesmen who found a working automobile and tried to explain its internal functioning without being able to open the hood. Today, modern neuroscience has in effect lifted the hood and permitted us to peer, however tentatively, at the engine. Thinking is no longer a process that emerges mysteriously from a hidden mechanism. It is increasingly something that can be linked, at least in part, to cellular processes that occur in and among our neurons. And just as studying and understanding a car's engine gives us far greater power to fix and modify it, so understanding the biology behind thinking gives us greater power to alter how it works. Rather than reshaping our mental universe with words, music, or pictures perceived through our sensory channels, we might reshape it more directly by altering the brain's physiology that underlies it. This, for example, is what psychiatric medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors do when they transform a brooding, depressed individual fearful of social contact into someone who sees the world more positively and lives more boldly. Indeed, the most well-known of these SSRI eye drugs, fluoxetine, has already been the subject of extensive attention in books and newspapers. In listening to Prozac, for example, Peter D. Kramer describes cases where the Prozac it prescribed to patients did not merely treat that patient's depression but transformed their personalities. Prozac, he writes, seemed to give social confidence to the habitually timid, to make the sensitive brash, to lend the introvert the social skills of salesmen. Is such direct chemically induced alteration of our mental functioning covered by the freedom of thought that jurists have long found in the First Amendment? Are we in the realm of that constitutional freedom when we reconfigure the emotional and cognitive lens on the world chemically rather than culturally? If, for example, we banish a state of depression or mental paralysis, not as William Styron did in responding to Brahms' music, nor as John Stuart Mill did by reading Marmontel's memoirs and Wordsworth's poetry, but as many as individuals now do by taking Prozac, are we protected to any degree by our First Amendment freedom of thought? And are people protected when they use such drugs, neurofeedback, or other technologies of cognitive enhancement, not to treat psychological illness, but rather to move their psychologically healthy minds to a state they prefer. I suggest in this article that they sometimes are. The power to reshape our thinking processes biologically should be recognized as merely one form of a more general power that our freedom of mind is intended to place firmly in our own hands, not in the hands of government officials, namely, the power to make autonomous choices about the shape of the self that perceives, learns, archives, and reimagines the world. As Lawrence Tribe similarly suggests, whether the government decides to interfere with our mental autonomy by confiscating books and films or by denying us psychiatric medications, the offense is ultimately the same: government invasion and usurpation of the choices that together constitute an individual psyche. Does our constitution jurisprudence little good to blind ourselves to this reality? Non-scare of souls should therefore remain as much as possible in the realm of individual autonomy. Part 1 summarizes the debate surrounding cognitive enhancement and then focuses on an argument within it that forms a key part of my thesis. Philosopher Neil Levi's position that since we already alter our minds by changing our environment, we should not view as unethical an equivalent change worked through our neurochemistry unless we can identify an ethically relevant difference. In other words, he argues, societies have long allowed and even endorsed people's alteration of what Andy Clark and David Chalmers describe as the extended mind, the uses of certain tools and machines in the world to carry out a function that would otherwise be carried out solely inside of our minds. If you allow these alterations of thinking from the outside, why not also from the inside? Part 2 then extends this ethics argument to the realm of constitutional law. Freedom of thought should cover the certain crucial supports and tools for thinking we find in the environment, including cognitive enhancement with medications and other technologies. This is not only framework for understanding the place of cognitive enhancement technology in freedom of thought jurisprudence. However, Part 3 and Part 4 consider two other alternatives and explain why they fall short. Part 3 considers what I call the government purposes account. This approach allows freedom of thought to operate on its own, even where there are no free speech or no free exercise rights at stake. But the government purpose account gives freedom of thought such independence through a questionable device. Whether there is a freedom of thought violation under this approach depends not on what the government actually restricts, but on what the government intends to restrict. This view of freedom is embraced by a number of court decisions and scholarly analysis, but I ultimately argue that it is too uncertain a foundation for such a right. Very thoughtful. in large part because that treatment has come to involve more than talk therapy. As noted above, it now involves use of powerful psychoactive drugs such as Prozac and other SSRI drugs. One of the most well-known accounts of such enhancements is psychiatrist Peter Kramer's vivid account of the changes he saw in some of the patients to whom he had prescribed Prozac. Kramer observed that Prozac seemed to do more than treat their underlying depression. It markedly changed their personalities. To change their personalities for other reasons, just as it is not only patients with severe burns or disfigurement who benefit from plastic surgery, but also those who seek cosmetic surgery to improve the appearance they have lived with. So the mentally healthy may likewise seek what Kramer dubbed cosmetic psychopharmacology. Drugs are not the only instruments of cognitive enhancement. Just as patients currently get pacemakers or artificial hearts, they may one day get surgically implanted brain chips designed to replicate missing brain functions, add to normal brain functions. Indeed, while key safety issues must be resolved, says one analyst of this technology, have a promising future, do not require implantation of any device or chemical into our bodies. For example, brain changes can be triggered from outside of our bodies with electrical currents, either by placing electrodes on our heads or with a coil placed near the head. Some studies have suggested that TMS and a form of electrical stimulation called transcranial direct current stimulation have some success in treating medication-resistant forms of depression. These neurofeedback devices allow us to change features of our mental processes that were previously unknown to us, such as the activation level of a part of our cerebral cortex or the frequency with which certain sets of neurons fire in synchrony. The ethics of cognitive enhancement. The rise of these cognitive enhancement tools has sparked a vigorous debate among scientists, policymakers, and public intellectuals about whether such use is wise or ethical, and whether it is acceptable for psychiatrists to prescribe these drugs to individuals who are not mentally ill. Recently, a group of prominent neuroscientists and neuroethicists added energy to this debate by proposing in Nature that healthy people should generally be allowed to take advantage of enhancement technology where it is safe to do so, calling for a presumption that mentally competent adults should be able to engage in cognitive enhancement using drugs. The debate is a complex and multifaceted one. However, there are a few key issues at its core, and it is worth briefly taking note of them. To give them the kind of personality that is most popular or successful in the community. Eric Parents notes in his summary of the ethics debate, many worry that so-called enhancement technologies will be used mostly to help individuals live up to dominant conceptions of normality and or perfection. Fukuyama similarly wonders whether modern biotechnology will not soon be in the business of providing powerful new biological shortcuts to reaching a politically correct ends. Individuals may also feel pressure to take cognitive enhancers to remain competitive in education and work environment. As Frank Pascal observed, such an environment may conceivably lead to an arms race where even those who strongly oppose medicating themselves feel that there is their only choice. Even if an individual's choice to use cognitive enhancement drugs is made willingly, not as a reluctant concession to social conformity or the demands of professional survival, critics worry that such freely chosen cognitive enhancement will still come at a steep cost. It may sever individual achievement from a close connection with external relationships. Permanentability or nature. Some who worry about the ethics of cognitive enhancement point to the danger of creating two classes of human beings: those with access to enhancement technology and those who must make do with an altered memory that fades with age. This is hilarious. I might need to cite this. For these reasons, say critics should be limited to treating the mentally ill, not enhancing the rest of us. They should be tools that psychiatrists use to help reconnect dysfunctional individuals with experience and with their community, not to shed or escape the responsibilities, struggles, and natural emotional rhythms that come with and define this communal existence. Each of these concerns has drawn skepticism from those more optimistic about prospect that cognitive enhancement treatments may improve lives marred by significant sadness, inability to focus, or shyness, and not simply lives marked by mental illness. Others wonder whether it is possible to limit the use of drugs to treatment rather than enhancement, when the line between these two uses of medication is often difficult to mark. Even those who oppose enhancement acknowledge how exceedingly difficult it is to distinguish neatly between medical and non-medical interventions, between treatment and enhancement, and between disorders rooted in the body and those rooted in the mind or social norms. Still, others doubt that access to drugs is likely to be marked by significant inequality, or that those who take such drugs will be significantly better off than those who do not. Finally, those who support the responsible use of cognitive enhancement drugs argue that enhancement with drugs is just a new method of doing what human beings have long done: use technology to improve themselves. As Arthur Kaplan writes, we are clearly creatures who have long tinkered with ourselves, using all manner of technologies from clothing to telescope to computers to airplanes, and we predictably adapt ourselves to these technologies. These authors argue that enhancement technologies are not as novel as some claim, and in many ways merit the same treatment as technologies before the era of neuroenhancement. I turn to a particular variant of this argument based on the notion of the extended mind that I will claim is of special interest for legal thinkers. In their essay, The Extended Mind, and Andy Clark and David Chalmers raised the possibility that the mind extends into and that mental processes may include certain parts of the external environment. In their essay, The Extended Mind, Andy Clark and David Chalmers raised the possibility that mind extends into that mental processes may include certain parts of the external environment. When we think, they argue, our thinking is done not only with the biological machinery in our brain, but also with certain resources in the external environments. This argument is principally about how to conceptualize mind, not about the ethics of enhancing our minds. But as Neil Levi shows, the extended mind thesis has important implications for the ethical debates over enhancement. If critics of enhancement raise no objection to letting people enhance and extend their minds from the outside, With tools like computers, calculators, and talk therapy sessions, then writes Levi, it is not clear why it is any worse for people to extend and enhance their minds from the inside by altering their neurochemistries. To better understand this argument, it is helpful to consider Clark and Calmer's most well-known illustration for how it is that mental processes can partly occur outside of our brain and bodies. They tell the story of two individuals, Inga and Otto, who are in Manhattan and want to go to the Museum of Modern Art. They try to recall where it is located. However, Inga and Otto perform this recall task quite differently moment and recalls that the museum is on 53rd Street. Otto, by contrast, suffers from Alzheimer's disease and no longer has the kind of intact neuronal circuitry that allows for unaided recall. He thus relies on a notebook to help record and remember facts he could otherwise not remember. He does so in this case, and he learns from his journal that the museum is on 53rd Street. Itself, because in relevant respects the cases are entirely analogous, the notebook plays for Odo the same role that memory plays for Inga. Some might argue that the cases are different because Inga knows the location of the museum and simply must remember it. Odo does not know it until he first relearns it by opening the notebook and seeing what addresses he wrote down on a previous occasion. But as Clark and Calmer pointed out, this characterization is misleading. Neither Inga nor Odo is aware of the location of the museum, neither has it in his or her consciousness until they retrieve it into consciousness from some other sources. In Inga's case, she retrieves it from neuronal codings that store this information, and in Odo's case, he retrieves it from pen marks. How does this example inform an ethical? Underscore the conceptual equivalence of the two recall tests to argue that both external and internal storage devices constitute as an essential components of the cognitive process. They set forth that they call a party principle to put external cognition on par with its internal equivalent. If, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the hand, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as part of our cognitive process, then the part of the world is we claim part of the cognitive process. Levi further observes that this example might weigh in favor not only of treating the use of the two processes as conceptually equivalent, but also ethically Some different methods of addressing his brain's ability to remember facts as easily as Inga's does. Buying a journal and establishing a routine of consulting it each time he needs to retrieve important. The First Amendment and the challenge of cognitive enhancement. The concept of the extended mind arguably has constitutional as well as ethical significance. Consider again the way in which Odo extends his cognitive process of recalling a piece of information. He writes information down in a journal and then consults in it at a later time. He engages in a kind of expressive activity which in the American constitutional system is protected under the First Amendment. Not engaging in the kind of First Amendment speech that is issued in most court cases on the subject, he is not using writing to communicate with another person as a shortcut from mind to mind. He is using it as a means of enhancing his own thinking. Nonetheless, courts protect such solitary speech under the First Amendment. Oh, really? I really love that order. I really love these cases. They protect notes taken for one's own use and drawing made for one's own benefit. They protect notes taken for one's own use and drawings made for their own benefits. Make sense of such protection for the journal, not based only on freedom of speech, but freedom of the thinking that underlies it. It is thus appropriate that in George Orwell's portrait of a thought police-dominated dystopia, the protagonist's opening rebellion against thought control begins with an entry in a diary. While such a journal entry is a speech act, it is also an act by which one records memories, ideas, and feelings, and by doing so can not only preserve one's thinking but better sharpen or expand upon it. These observations raise a question: if the enabling and enhancement of thought is protected when carried out with the aid of a journal, does it receive the same or similar constitutional protection when it is enhanced with our technologies? I argued that it is the use of virtual reality technology to embody and build upon the products of one's imagination may merit First Amendment protection for the same reasons we provided to a paper or electronic journal. Seth Kramer has made a similar argument about the use of camera to capture information, drawing directly on Clark and Calmer's concept of extended mind. If the author's use of a journal to record and remember facts is protected by the First Amendment, he argues, should a person's use of cell phone camera be protected to capture such information in photographs? Okay, I'm gonna take some break. I dived very deep into this arena, and I'm gonna maybe resume the session after an hour, I guess. Thank you.